Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they fit in with your coaching community, with working with you, with, I don't know, the larger community that is people who exercise? Do they belong there? If they don't, if they're not checking those ABC boxes, that could be why you see them only relying on extrinsic types of motivation. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Not Another Mindset Show. Today we are talking about motivation and all of the different types of motivation that exist, while highlighting that it's not necessarily that you need more motivation or that your clients need more motivation. It's just that you or your clients need more of the right type of motivation. So without knowing more about self-determination theory and all of the different types of motivation that exist, we just use one word, motivation. But the reality is there's a lot of different types of motivation, and some are going to be far more beneficial when it comes to behavior change and lasting behavior change than others. So we can't talk about motivation without talking about self-determination theory, which I kind of just hinted at. And I've mentioned self-determination theory a handful of times on the podcast, mainly when I'm talking about basic psychological needs of autonomy, belongingness, and competence. And I actually walk through all three of those basic psychological needs in depth in a different episode. It's the ABCs of behavior change, I believe it's called. So I'll make sure that that is linked in the show notes if you want to dive into those further. But basically, when we talk about these basic psychological needs, people are motivated to get these needs met. They are motivated to feel autonomous, to feel like they belong, and to feel like they're competent. And when those needs are met, they are more motivated to do whatever task behavior is in front of them. So if they feel autonomous, they feel like they belong, they feel like they're competent, they're more likely to do the thing. So in our coaching practices, we really need to be paying attention to those things. And like I said, I have a whole episode on that specifically, but it is important to note here since we're talking about motivation, because if those basic psychological needs are met, it's something that you are paying attention to in your coaching when you're working with your clients, or honestly, even like speaking to your children or your significant others. You want them to do something, those things need to be met. Those people in your lives, whether it be clients or otherwise, are more likely to do it if those needs are met. And so when we're talking about motivation and the different types of motivation, and we're trying to help our clients or ourselves find more of the best kind of motivation, which we'll talk about, then these basic psychological needs are important to keep in mind. So outside of the basic psychological needs, we need to understand that there is a spectrum. Just like with freaking everything, there are gray areas, there's a middle ground. It's not all or nothing or black or white or good or bad. There is an in-between. And we need to consider that when we're talking about motivation, when we're thinking about motivation, when we want to have more quote unquote motivated clients. This is something you need to keep in mind. So with this spectrum of motivation, and this is all coming from self-determination theory, so this is coming from a long-standing framework in behavior change within the research on behavior change and psychology. We have the spectrum. So I was going to say everyone knows, but it's possible you don't know this, that there are kind of two main types of motivation when we're speaking about it from this lens, and that is extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. You can kind of think of it as external and internal. But again, that lies on a spectrum. So what falls in between extrinsic and intrinsic is also important to understand, especially if you want to help your clients move from more extrinsic motivators to more intrinsic motivators, which should be the goal, by the way. And when we're talking about the quote unquote best type of motivation, what I'm really referring to is intrinsic motivation. So I'm going to work us along this spectrum and kind of describe each of the steps along the way from extrinsic to intrinsic. So with extrinsic motivation, it is motivation driven by external factors. Pretty much says it in the word, right? So when we're talking about extrinsic motivation, this is external rewards, external pressure. If you have a client who is simply checking in and going to the gym and eating healthy just to appease you, just to make you proud, just to do the things that won't disappoint you, that is extrinsic motivation. Or maybe this is someone who has a hard time sticking to something unless they have some sort of external reward, like they're working towards a competition, or they have a wedding, or a specific goal that they have that is tied to an external reward or outcome that's not just about them. So if motivation is mainly coming from this, you can see where it would be relatively short term. This is not something that's going to sustain a long-term behavior change. It's not necessarily bad. Like if you have a client who wants to compete in a high rocks competition, I just learned that high rocks stands for hybrid rock star. And I can't get over that. It seems so silly. High rock sounds like kind of like tough and intense. And then it's like hybrid rock star. Funny. Anyway, so if they want to train for that for fun as part of their overall health and fitness journey, sure, fine. But if they always need some sort of competition to look forward to, or something that they need to train for and compete in, that's where you need to kind of pay attention. So after extrinsic motivation, we can go to the next step on the spectrum, which is introjected regulation. I really wish researchers would use terms that like make any kind of sense, but instead it just sounds like scientific jargon. But introjected regulation, this is when clients are engaging in activities mainly to avoid guilt or feel better about themselves. So this might be your client who maybe feels obligated to exercise because their husband frequently exercises, or you hear a lot of like the language of, I feel like I should be doing this. It's not a want, it's that they feel like they should. So there's still some sort of like external, whether it's societal pressure from you, pressure from others. So, but they're motivated to do that in order to not feel guilty for not doing it, or to feel better about themselves, rather than really wanting to do it or having any internal drive. So when it comes to coaching, you really want to help clients recognize their motivations and try to work them away from some of these external pressures, be it extrinsic motivation, introjected regulation. Here's the thing. I don't need you to remember these terms. And this is what I tell my students too, because this is something we go in depth in the health mindset coaching certification. So it's not imperative that you remember these terms, but it is imperative that you understand that there's kind of like this progression from extrinsic to intrinsic. And I don't even want to say progression, because it's not a step-by-step process that you start with extrinsic motivation and then you end at intrinsic motivation, but you could be landing anywhere on the spectrum, and you could also have more than one of them at play. Your clients could have more than one of them at play. So after introjected regulation, okay, first we had extrinsic motivation, then we had introjected regulation, which is still technically extrinsic, okay? We move on to another extrinsic type of motivation called identified regulation. So fully extrinsic and then introjected, and now we have identified. In identified regulation, these clients recognize the importance of an activity and its value to their goals. So this is a client who understands that if I regularly exercise, that's beneficial for my long-term health. And I am motivated to exercise because it's beneficial for my long-term health. So this is not obviously a bad thing, right? At face value, we know that if someone is doing something because they recognize the importance of those behaviors and the value it has to some of their other goals, maybe they want to be a good role model for their children. So that's why they're eating healthy and taking care of themselves. Those are not bad things, because it's identified because you're identifying the activity with a value, a personal value or belief that you have. So as you can kind of tell, we made somewhat of a shift already from extrinsic to introjected to now this identified form of regulation. And when I say regulation, I'm really meaning like motivation. Again, interchangeable terms, researchy terms. So identified regulation is moving us towards intrinsic motivation on the spectrum, right? So the next one is integrated regulation. So this is where clients or yourself, if you're thinking about yourself and your own motivations, you feel aligned or your clients feel aligned with their goals as part of their identity. So, which is also so confusing. Like, riddle me this. Why did we name this integrated regulation when identified regulation is related to your values and the goals that you have, but integrated regulation is about your identity? Wouldn't it have been smart to call identified regulation something that has to do with your identity? It would have been, but researchers don't think this way when they create things. So integrated regulation is maybe a client who sees fitness as part of their overall self-image. They identify themselves as an exerciser, as a fit person, as a healthy person. So now you're motivated to exercise and eat well because it's part of who you are. That's pretty good, right? So as you can tell, we're getting closer to intrinsic motivation based on sort of these more internal types of motivation. When we're talking about broadly self-determination theory, and why it's called that is because we're talking about motivations that are self-determined or not self-determined. So as you can see, when we get into identified regulation and integrated regulation, the last two that I just described, they are more self-determined compared to introjected, which is, again, feeling like you need to do something in order to feel better about yourself, avoid guilt, or extrinsic, which is just based on external pressures from other people, other things. So as a quick recap, I'm doing my best to make this as seamless as possible when I don't have like a diagram to show you or something because you're listening, right? We had extrinsic, introjected, identified, integrated, and finally, we have intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is the motivation that comes from personal satisfaction and enjoyment. So this might be, there's a couple ways we could look at intrinsic motivation. There could be intrinsic motivation to know and to understand. So maybe you have a client who's driven to learn more and better understand their bodies, and they're really interested in the science of nutrition and exercise. That might have been you at one point. Now you are a coach. So if you have a client who is enjoying like researching nutrition and fitness techniques and they want to learn more from you, they have a lot of intrinsic motivation because they have this motivation, this drive to learn more. Or there's a intrinsic motivation to accomplish something, like clients who find joy in mastering new skills or achieving personal goals. A client who loves hitting new personal records on their strength training program, and they're doing so because it gives them personal satisfaction, not because they're beating someone else, but because it feels good to them. So that kind of gives you the full rundown on the spectrum of motivation. And I hope I just didn't confuse the hell out of you, because as I'm saying all of this, I'm like, man, this just feels like a mouthful of words. But again, the most important thing to remember is that people are going to fall on all different parts of the spectrum. They're going to have motivation that comes from a variety of different things. It is your job as a coach to better understand where their motivation is coming from. And if they are falling more on the extrinsic side of the spectrum, external pressure, doing it so they feel better about themselves and they don't feel guilty, you need to pay attention to that, because those aren't going to be very great for long-term behavior change. Whereas if you can start to help your clients maybe recognize identified or integrated types of motivation, so you're helping them recognize the values that they have or the identity that they have and how that attaches to some of these health and fitness goals, that is more self-determined and more part of them and less external. So they're going to be more likely to stick with it. And then the best kind of motivation, the thing that's really going to, and you guys can understand this, if you enjoy something and you get personal satisfaction out of it, of course you want to keep doing it. So as coaches, it's not our job to give our clients more motivation or to make them be more motivated. It is our jobs to understand where their motivation is coming from and do our best to guide them to uncovering more of these internal motivations, wherever that kind of falls on the spectrum, away from external or extrinsic. So how do we do this? How do we nurture motivation and pinpoint where our clients are at? Like, obviously ask more questions, maybe consider enrolling in the health mindset coaching certification, because that's where we talk about this in depth. But this brings us back to the beginning of the podcast when I was talking about autonomy, belongingness, and competence. So if you are including those things in your coaching and you're assessing your clients, I really love using it as an assessment. So if you have a client who is struggling to stick with a plan and stay consistent, it can be a pretty easy, if you understand these concepts, and again, join us in HMCC if you really want to understand them. Autonomy, belongingness, and competence. You have this client who's struggling. Do they feel autonomous? Do they feel like, are you looking at this client and their communication with you? Does it seem like they can make their own decisions, that they're sitting in the driver's seat? Do they feel competent? Do they actually like know what they're doing and can get around the gym on their own and track their macros or whatever? Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel like they fit in with your coaching community, with working with you, with, I don't know, the larger community that is people who exercise? Do they belong there? If they don't, if they're not checking those ABC boxes, that could be why you see them only relying on extrinsic types of motivation. And you could be leveraging the ABCs to help them find more intrinsic style, more internal, more self-determined style motivations that are going to help them stick with it. Okay. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to add here. I think really so much of this comes down to kind of playing the researcher as the coach, but you're researching your clients' behaviors and their communication with you. And if you feel like you have clients who just can't stay motivated, the first thing I would do is really like take a look at this spectrum, see where they're falling, maybe even have a conversation with them. I have done this with clients in the past so many times where I explain all these different types of motivation and I ask them, see, autonomy, hello. I ask them to tell me where they think they fall on the spectrum or where their motivations are coming from. And a lot of times then where the conversation goes is like, I really would like to enjoy this more. I really would like more satisfaction. I really want to identify as a person who exercises. I really want to tie my values into this more. And now they are driving the conversation, again, autonomy, and you can kind of take it from there. So all this to say, it's not about making your clients more motivated. It's not about them needing more motivation. It's really about what types of motivation are we dealing with here. You have to remember too, we're always motivated to do something. So the reality is, how do we shift that energy of motivation into something else and also work on finding ways for it to be more self-determined, more internal, and if we can get to that point of intrinsic motivation, that's where it really is the best, because we're doing it because we enjoy it and we find satisfaction in it. I think a lot of you listening to this podcast, if you are a health and fitness coach, you likely do find a lot of enjoyment and personal satisfaction in your workouts, in what you eat and making healthy recipes and stuff like that. And if you think about it, it's like, if we could just take that and package it up and put it into all of our clients, how much more successful they would be. That is intrinsic motivation. And we can't necessarily expect people to get there right away or get there easily, but we can guide them and you can help them. So if you're sitting there thinking like, yeah, Kasey, this all sounds fine and good, and I love that there's a spectrum and different types of motivation, and this is a really interesting way to think about it, but I just don't understand how I would ever help my clients get there. Like, that is what the health mindset coaching certification is for. There's literally no way I could do all of that for you on the podcast, because it does require practice. It requires understanding more about human motivation and desire and behavior change and how all of that works. You got to have a good grasp on client psychology if you want to be an effective coach when it comes to actually helping your clients achieve long-term results. I did not mean for this episode to be a sales pitch, but the thing is, I want to help you and I want so much more for you and the coaching industry in general. And that's why the certification was created. And I can only do so much on the podcast. But I do hope this was helpful, even if it was to just make you think about motivation differently when it comes to working with your clients and also in your own life. And that's actually a good thing for me to leave you with is don't just be thinking about your clients. Think about your own motivations to do things, whether there's personal goals, health and fitness goals, business goals, whatever. Where on that spectrum do you lie? Like at what types of motivation are you pulling on? And if you pay attention, you'll see the places where you've been the most successful are probably the ones that have more internal, intrinsic drives to do things. Okay. Like I said, I will actually leave you at that. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you next week.